Chapter 5 page. The Tarahumara festivals that include ritual foot races up and down the 95 mountains of northern Mexico for hundreds of miles are described in Lumholtz 1902-1987 and Nabokov 1981. An account of the ritual elements involved in modern sports is given by McAloon's 1981 study of the modern Olympics. 97. The Icarus complex was explored by Henry A. Murray, 1955. At this point, it might be appropriate to confront squarely the Freudian concept of sublimation, a topic that, if bypassed, might leave us with the nagging feeling of an unresolved problem. Superficial applications of Freud's thought have led many people to interpret any action that is not directed to the satisfaction of basic sexual desires, either as a defense, when it aims to hold back an unacceptable wish that otherwise might be expressed, or as a sublimation, when an acceptable goal is substituted for a desire that could not be safely expressed in its original form. At best, sublimation is a poor substitute for the unsatisfied pleasure it helps to disguise. For example, Bergler, 1970, has argued that games involving risk provide a release from guilt about sexuality and aggression. According to the Icarus complex, a high jumper is trying to escape from the ties of an Oedipal tangle in a socially acceptable way, but without really resolving the basic conflict that motivates his actions. Similarly, Jones, 1931, and Fine, 1956, have explained chess as a way of coping with castration anxiety. To mate the opponent's king with the help of one's queen is a sublimated enactment of the father's castration with the collusion of the mother. And mountain climbing has been explained as sublimated penis envy. Nobody seems to do anything, according to this point of view, except to resolve a festering childhood anxiety. The logical consequence of reducing motivation to a search for pleasure that is instigated by a few basic genetically programmed desires, however, is a failure to account for much of the behavior that differentiates humans from other animal species. To illustrate this, it is useful to examine the role of enjoyment in an evolutionary perspective. Life is shaped as much by the future as it is by the past. The first fish to leave the sea for dry land were not programmed to do so, but exploited unused potentials in their makeup to take advantage of the opportunities of an entirely new environment. The monkeys who use sticks to fish for ants at the mouth of anthills are not following a destiny carved in their genes, but are experimenting with possibilities that in the future may lead to the conscious use of tools and hence to what we call progress. And certainly human history can only be understood as the action of people striving to realize indistinct dreams. It is not a question of teleology, the belief that our actions are the unfolding of a preordained destiny, because teleology is also a mechanistic concept. The goals we pursue are not determined in advance or built into our makeup. They are discovered in the process of enjoying the extension of our skills in novel settings, in new environments. Enjoyment seems to be the mechanism that natural selection has provided to ensure that we will evolve and become more complex. This argument has been made in Csikszentmihalyi and Massimini, 1985, I. Csikszentmihalyi, 1988, and M. Csikszentmihalyi, 1988. The evolutionary implications of flow were also perceived by Crook, 1980. Just as pleasure from eating makes us want to eat more, and pleasure from physical love makes us want to have sex, both of which we need to do in order to survive and reproduce, enjoyment motivates us to do things that push us beyond the present and into the future. It makes no sense to assume that only the pursuit of pleasure is the source of natural desires, and any other motivation must be its pale derivative. The rewards of reaching new goals are just as genuine as the rewards of satisfying old needs. 99. The study of the relationship between happiness and energy consumption was reported in Grafe, Giannino, and Csikszentmihalyi, 1981. 100. The U.S. dancer's quotations are from Csikszentmihalyi, 1975, p. 104. The Italian dancer's is from Della Fave and Massimini, 1988, p. 212. The cultivation of sexuality. An excellent historical review of Western ideas about love and of the behaviors that accompanied it is given in the 3 volumes of The Nature of Love by Irving Singer, 1981. A compendium of contemporary psychologists' views on love was collected by Kenneth Pope, 1980. A very recent statement on the subject is by the Yale psychologist Robert Sternberg, 1988, who expands the classical description of love as eros or as agape to three components: intimacy, passion, and commitment. Liza Dalby, 1983, an American anthropologist who spent a few years training as a geisha in Kyoto, gives a good description of the refinements involved in the Far Eastern approach to sexuality. For the lack of romance in antiquity, see Vane, 1987, SPP 202-5. 104. The way in which the rules of the Jesuit order developed by St. Ignatius of Loyola helped organize life as a unified activity potentially suited to provide flow experience for those who followed them is described in I. Csikszentmihalyi, 1986-1988, and Toscano, 1986. A brief introduction to Patanjali's yoga can be found in the Encyclopedia Britannica, 1985, Vol. 12, p. 146. Eliade, 1969, provides a more thorough immersion in the subject. 107. Some of the most powerful contemporary insights on the psychology of aesthetics are in the works of Arnheim, 1954, 1971, 1982, and Gombrich, 1954-1979, who stressed the role of order or negative entropy in art. For more psychoanalytically oriented approaches, see the 3 volumes edited by Mary Ghetto, Psychoanalytic Perspectives on Art, 1986, 1987, 1988. There is that wonderful is from Csikszentmihalyi and Robinson, in Press, 107. When I See Works, and On a Day Like This, are from 108, Csikszentmihalyi and Robinson, in Press, 109. The use of music by the Pygmies is described in Turnbull, 1961. The importance of music in the lives of Americans is mentioned in The Meaning of Things, Csikszentmihalyi and Rochberg-Halton, 1981, where it was found that for teenagers the most important object in the home tended to be the stereo set. The Policeman's Interview is also from the same source. How music helps teenagers recover their good moods and its role in providing a matrix of peer solidarity are discussed in Csikszentmihalyi and Larson, 1984, and Larson and Kuby, 1983. Recorded music makes life richer. I heard this argument propounded most forcefully, but, I think, quite erroneously, by the aesthetic philosopher Eliseo Vivas at a public lecture in Lake Forest College, Illinois, sometime in the late 1960s. 110. Durkheim developed his concept of collective effervescence as a precursor of religiosity in his Elementary Forms of Religious Life, 1912-1967. Victor Turner's Communitas provides a contemporary perspective on the importance of spontaneous social interaction, 1969-1974. The writings of Carlos Castaneda, e.g. 1971-1974, so influential even a decade ago, now barely produce a ripple on the collective consciousness. Much has been said to discredit the authenticity of his accounts. The last few volumes of the enduring saga of his sorcerer's apprenticeship seem indeed confused and pointless. But the first 4 volumes contained many important ideas, intriguingly presented. For these, the old Italian saying applies, se non è vero, è ben trovato, or it may not be true, but it is well conceived. 110. The stages of musical listening were described in an unpublished 111 empirical study by Michael Heifetz at the University of Chicago. A similar developmental trajectory was postulated earlier by the musicologist Leonard Meyer, 1956. 111. Plato expresses his views on music in the Republic, Book 3, in the dialogue between Glaucon and Socrates about the aims of education. The idea is that children should not be exposed to either plaintive or relaxed music, because both will undermine their character. Thus, Ionian and Lydian harmonies should be eliminated from the curriculum. The only acceptable harmonies are the Dorian and the Phrygian, because these are the strains of necessity and the strains of freedom, inculcating courage and temperance in the young. Whatever one may think of Plato's taste, it is clear that he took music very seriously. Here is what Socrates says, Book 3, 401. And therefore I said, Glaucon, musical training is a more potent instrument than any other, because rhythm and harmony find their way into the inward place of the soul, on which they mightily fasten, imparting grace, and making the soul of him who is rightly educated graceful. Alan Bloom, 1987, SPP 6881. provides a spirited defense of Plato and an indictment of modern music, presumably because it has an affinity for Ionian and Lydian harmonies. 112. Lauren Hollander's story is based on conversations we had in 1985. 113. Eating. For instance, ESM studies show that of the main things adult Americans do during an average day, eating is the most intrinsically motivated. Grafe, Csikszentmihalyi, and Giannino, 1983. Teenagers report the second highest levels of positive affect when eating, after socializing with peers, which is the most positive, and very high levels of intrinsic motivation, lower only than listening to music, being involved in sports and games, and resting. Csikszentmihalyi and Larson, 1984, p. 300. 114. Cyrus the Great. The information comes from Xenophon's 431 BC, 350 BC, Cyropedia, a fictional account of Cyrus's life. But Xenophon is the only contemporary who had actually served in Cyrus's army and who has left a written record of the man and his exploits. See also his Anabasis, translated as The Persian Expedition, Warner, 1965. 115. Puritans and Enjoyment. On this topic, see the extensive history by Foster Rhea Dulles, 1965, Jane Carson's account of recreation in colonial Virginia, 1965, and Chapter 5 in Kelly, 1982. Chapter 6 page reading. In the interviews conducted by Professor Massimini around 117 the world, reading books was the most often mentioned flow activity, especially in traditional groups undergoing modernization. Massimini, Csikszentmihalyi, and Delafave, 1988, pp. 74-75. See also the study by Nell of How Reading Provides Enjoyment, 1988. Mental puzzles. The Dutch historian Johan Huizinga, 1939-1970, argued that science and scholarship in general originated in riddling games. Works of Art is from Csikszentmihalyi and Robinson in Press. 119. The normal state of the mind is chaos. This conclusion is based on various lines of evidence collected with the ESM. For example, of all the things teenagers do, thinking is the least intrinsically motivating activity and one of the highest on negative effect and on passivity. Csikszentmihalyi and Larson, 1984, p. 300. This is because people say they are thinking only when they are not doing anything else, when there are no external demands on their mind. The same pattern holds for adults, who are least happy and motivated when their mind is not engaged by an externally structured activity. Kubi and Csikszentmihalyi in Press. The various sensory deprivation experiments also show that without patterned input of information, the organization of consciousness tends to break down. For instance, George Miller writes, "The mind survives by ingesting information." Miller, 1983, p. 111. A more general claim is that organisms survive by ingesting negentropy, Schrödinger, 1947. The negative quality of the television viewing experience has been documented by several ESM studies, e.g., Csikszentmihalyi and Kube, 1981, Csikszentmihalyi and Larson, 1984, Csikszentmihalyi, Larson and Prescott, 1977, Kubi and Csikszentmihalyi in Press, and Larson and Kubi, 1983. Mental imagery. For some of Singer's work on daydreaming, see Singer, 1966, 1973, 1981, and Singer and Switzer, 1980. In the last decade, a widespread mental imagery movement has developed in the U.S. 121. The Buñuel reference is from Sachs, 1970-1987, p. 23. Reciting names of ancestors. Generally, the task of remembering belongs to the elder members of the tribe, and sometimes it is assigned to the chief. For example, the Melanesian chief has no administrative work, he has no function, properly speaking, but in him are enclosed the clan's myth, tradition, alliances, and strengths. When he delivers from his own lips the clan names and the marvelous phrases which have moved generations, he enlarges time for each one. The chief's authority rests on a simple quality which is his alone. He himself is the word of the clan. Lienhardt, 1947, pp. 107-18. One example of how complex kinship reckoning can be is illustrated by Evans Pritchard's work on the Nuer of the Sudan, who divide their ancestors in maximal, major, minor, and minimal lineages, all connecting to each other for 5 or 6 ascending generations. Evans Pritchard, 1940-1978. 122 riddles. The rhyme translated by Charlotte Guest, as well as the material on the following page. come from the famous account Robert Graves, 1960, gives of the origins of poetry and literacy in The White Goddess. Graves belonged to that wonderful period of British academic life, when serious scholarship coexisted with unfettered flights of the imagination, the period when C.S. Lewis and R.R. Tolkien taught classics and wrote science fiction at Oxford. Graves's mythopedic reconstructions are controversial, but they provide the layperson with a feeling for what the quality of thought and experience might have been in the distant past, to an extent that one cannot get from works of more cautious scholarship. 123 Rote Learning. H.E. Garrett, 1941, has reviewed the experimental evidence that contributed to the demise of rote learning in schools. See also Suppes, 1978. This evidence showed that learning nonsense syllables did not improve a generalized aptitude for remembering. It is difficult to understand why educators would have thought such results relevant to making students stop memorizing meaningful texts. 124. The control of memory. Remembering, like dreaming, seems not to be a process under volitional control of the self. We cannot bring into consciousness information that refuses to be called up. But just as with dreaming, except even more so, if one is willing to invest energy in it, memory can be greatly improved. With a little method and discipline, it is possible to build a whole set of mnemonic devices to help remember material that otherwise would be forgotten. For a recent review of how some of these methods were used in antiquity and the Renaissance, see Spence, 1984. 125. The reference to Archytas and his thought experiments is from De Santillana, 1961-1970, p. 63. The Evolution of Arithmetic and Geometry. Wittfogel, 1957, gives a brilliant materialist account of the development of the sciences, as well as political forms, on the basis of the prior development of irrigational techniques. That new cultural products are developed more for the sake of enjoyment than out of necessity is argued in Csikszentmihalyi, 1988. This seems to be true even in the introduction of such basic techniques as the use of metals. In several areas of the world, it has been noted, in the case of metallurgical innovation in particular, that the development of bronze and other metals as useful commodities was a much later phenomenon than their first utilization as new and attractive materials employed in contexts of display. In most cases, early metallurgy appears to have been practiced primarily because products have novel properties that made them attractive to use as symbols and as personal adornments and ornaments, in a manner that, by focusing attention, could attract or enhance prestige. Renfrew, 1986, pp. 144-146. Huizinga, 1939-1970, argued that institutions such as religion, law, government, and the armed forces originally started as play forms, or games, and only gradually did they become rigid and serious. Similarly, Max Weber, 1958, pointed out that capitalism started as an adventurous game of entrepreneurs, and only later, when its practices became rigidified in laws and conventions, did it become an iron cage. 126. For the anecdotes concerning Democritus, see De Santillana, 1961-1970, pp. 127. For an introduction to the sagas of Iceland, see Schooley Johnson's 1930 collection, 129. The argument about how conversation helps maintain the symbolic universe is in Berger and Luckman, 1967. 131. How poetry can be taught to ghetto children and to old people in retirement homes without formal education is beautifully told by Koch, 1970-1977. 132. Writing and depression. At least since the Romantic era, artists of all types have been held to be tortured or demonically impelled. There is reasonably good evidence that many modern artists and writers in fact show a variety of depressive and obsessive symptoms. See e.g. Alvarez 1973, Berman 1988, Csikszentmihalyi 1988, and Matson 1980. Recently, much has been written also about the relationship of manic depression and literary creativity. Andreasen 1987, Richards et al. 1988. It is very likely, however, that this relationship between psychic entropy and artistic creativity is the result of specific cultural expectations and of the awkward structure of the artistic role, rather than anything necessarily inherent in art or in creativity. In other words, If, to survive as an artist in a given social environment, a person has to put up with insecurity, neglect, ridicule, and a lack of commonly shared expressive symbols, he or she is likely to show the psychic effects of these adverse conditions. Vasari in 1550 was one of the first to express concern that the personality of the young Italian artists of the time, already influenced by Mannerism, a precursor of Baroque and Romantic styles, displayed a certain element of savagery and madness, which made them appear strange and eccentric in a way that previous artists were not. Vasari 1550-1959, p. 232. In earlier periods, such as the thousands of years of Egyptian civilization or the Middle Ages, artists were apparently quite pleasant and well-adjusted. Hauser 1951. And of course, there are several more recent examples of great artists like J.S. Bach, Goethe, Dickens, or Verdi that disprove the existence of a necessary link between creativity and neurosis. Remembering the personal past. In part under the influence of Erikson's psychobiographical accounts of the lives of Hitler, Gorky, Luther, and Gandhi, 1950, 1958, 1969, a concern for personal narrative has become prominent in lifespan developmental psychology. C. Kohler, 1982, Freeman, 1989, Gergen and T. Gergen, 1983, 1984, McAdams, 1985, Robinson, 1988, Sarbin, 1986, and Schaefer, 1980. This perspective claims that knowing how a person sees his or her own past is one of the best ways to predict what he or she will do in the future. 132. Every home a museum. Csikszentmihalyi and Rochberg Halton, 1981, 133, studied over 300 members of three generational families around Chicago, who were asked in their homes to show interviewers their favorite objects and to explain the reasons for cherishing them. 134. The four quotations from Thomas Kuhn's The Structure of Scientific 135 Revolutions, 1962, are from pages 24, 38, and 36, respectively. One of the most exciting promises of flow theory is that it may help explain why certain ideas, practices, and products are adopted while others are ignored or forgotten, since at this point the histories of ideas, institutions, and cultures work almost exclusively within a paradigm informed by economic determinism. In addition, it might be revealing to consider how history is directed by the enjoyment people derive or anticipate from different courses of action. A beginning in that direction is Isabella Csikszentmihalyi's analysis of the reasons for the success of the Jesuit order in the 16th and 17th centuries, 1988. 136 breakthroughs. It would go against the central message of this book to claim that the flow experience is good for you, in the sense that it helps people achieve scientific or any other kind of success. It needs to be stressed again and again that what counts is the quality of experience flow provides, and that this is more important for achieving happiness than riches or fame. At the same time, it would be disingenuous to ignore the fact that successful people tend to enjoy what they do to an unusual extent. This may indicate that people who enjoy what they are doing will do a good job of it, although, as we know, correlation does not imply causation. A long time ago, Maurice Schlick, 1934, pointed out how important enjoyment was in sustaining scientific creativity. In an interesting recent study, B. Eugene Griesman interviewed a potpourri of high achievers ranging from Francis H.C. Crick, the co-discoverer of the double helix, to Hank Aaron, Julie Andrews, and Ted Turner. 15 of these celebrities completed a questionnaire in which they rated the importance of 33 personal characteristics, such as creativity, competence, and breadth of knowledge, in terms of helping them achieve success. The item most strongly endorsed, for an average of 9.86 on a 10-point scale, was enjoyment of work, Griesman 1987, pp. 294-95. Another indication of how flow may be linked to success is suggested by the work of Larson, 1985-1988. In a study of high school juniors writing a month-long assignment, he found that the students who were bored wrote essays, expert English teachers found boring, students who were anxious wrote disconnected essays that were confusing to read, whereas students who enjoyed the writing task created essays that were enjoyable to read. This controlling for differences in intelligence or ability among the students. The obvious suggestion is that a person who experiences flow in an activity will end up with a product that others will find more valuable. The interview with the wife of Susumu Tanagawa appeared in USA Today, October 13, 1987, p. 2a. The amazing variety of things adults learn in their free time is D-138, scribed in the Investigations of Alan Tuff, 1978. See also Gross, 1982. One of the areas of knowledge to which laypersons continue to contribute is that concerning health. One keeps hearing how people, often mothers, will notice some peculiarities in the health patterns of members of their family, which, when communicated to health experts, turn out to have beneficial consequences. For example, Burton Ruesch, 1988, reports how a woman in New England, struck by the fact that her son and many of his friends were suffering from arthritic pains in the knee, alerted doctors of this suspicious coincidence, and as a result of her information, researchers discovered Lyme disease, a potentially serious affliction transmitted by ticks. 139. It may be presumptuous to present a reading list of the great philosophers, but to simply name them without a reference would also offend professional scruples. So here goes. A few of the most seminal works in each area might include the following. As to ontology, there are Christian von Wolff's Vernünftige Gedanken, Kant's Critique of Pure Reason, Flusserl's Ideas, General Introduction to Pure Phenomenology, and Heidegger's Being and Time, 1962. For these last two, it might be a good idea to start with the introductions to Husserl by Kohak, 1978, and by Kolakowski, 1987, and to Heidegger by George Steiner, 1978-1987. In terms of ethics, one would certainly wish to tackle Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, Aquinas' treatises on human acts, on habits, and on the active and contemplative life in the Summa Theologica, Benedict Spinoza's Ethics, and from Nietzsche, Beyond Good and Evil and Genealogy of Morals. In aesthetics, Alexander Baumgarten's Reflections on Poetry, Benedetto Croce's Aesthetics, Santayana's The Sense of Beauty, and Collingwood's The Principles of Art. The 54-volume series of the Great Books of the Western World, now edited by Mortimer Adler and published by the Encyclopaedia Britannica, is a good introduction to the most influential thinkers of our culture. The first two Syntopicon volumes, which contain a summary of the main ideas of the books that follow, could be especially useful to the amateur philosopher. 100 Medvedev, 1971, provides an informed account of how the agricultural 141 policies of Lyenko, based on Leninist dogma, resulted in food-short ages in Soviet Russia. See also Lecourt, 1977. Chapter 7 page for the time budget allocated to work by pre-literate people. See the 143 excellent volume by Marshall Solins, 1972, and the Estimates of Lee, 1975. Some glimpses of the working patterns of medieval Europe are to be found in Le Goff, 1980, and Leroy-Ladurie, 1979. The pattern of the working day of typical English workers before and after the advent of the Industrial Revolution is reconstructed by E.P. Thompson, 1963. The changing role of women as workers in the public sector is discussed by, among others, Clark, 1919, and Howell, 1986. 145 Serafina Vinon is one of the respondents in the group studied by Della Fave and Massimini, 1988. Her quote, "It gives me great satisfaction," is from P203. 147. The quote, "I am free," is from IBID. 149. Development and complexity. While most developmental psychology has remained determinedly value-free, at least in its rhetoric, if not in its substance, the psychology department at Clark University has maintained a relatively strong value orientation in its approach to human development, based on the notion that complexity is the goal of human growth, e.g. Kaplan 1983, Werner 1957, Werner and Kaplan 1956. For recent attempts in the same direction, see Robinson 1988 and Freeman and Robinson in Press 150. Ting was cutting up is in Watson 1964 p46, who translated Chuang Tzu's inner chapters. Some critics, the criticism that flow describes an exclusively Western state of mind was one of the first to be leveled at the flow concept. The specific contrast between flow and you was brought out by Sun, 1987. It is to be hoped that the ample cross-cultural evidence presented in Csikszentmihalyi and Csikszentmihalyi, 1988, will reassure skeptics that the flow experience is reported in almost exactly the same terms in vastly different non-Western cultures. 151, however, is from Watson, 1964, p. 97. Whaley, 1939, p. 39, is the scholar who thinks the quotation does not describe you, but its opposite, whereas Graham, cited in Crandall, 1983, and Watson, 1964, believe it describes Ting's own way of butchering, and therefore that it refers to you. 152 Navajos. Interviews with Navajo shepherds were conducted by Professor Massimini's group in the summers of 1984 and 1985. 153. The life of 17th and 18th century English weavers is described by E. P. Thompson, 1963. 155. The flow interviews of surgeons were conducted by Dr. Jean Hamilton and written up by her and I. Csikszentmihalyi, M. Csikszentmihalyi, 1975, pp. 123-39. 156. The first two quotations are from Csikszentmihalyi, 1975, p. 129. The next two from Ibid, p. 136. 158. The ESM study that looks at how much flow American workers report on their job and in leisure was reported in Csikszentmihalyi and Lefevre, 1987, 1989, and Lefevre, 1988. 160. Dissatisfaction. The low percentages of dissatisfied workers were computed by a meta-analysis performed in 1980 on 15 national surveys between 1972 and 1978. See Argyll, 1987, p. 32. Our studies of American workers. In addition to the ESM studies, here I am drawing on data I have collected over a period of 5 years, 1984 to 88, on about 400 managers from different companies in all parts of the country, who have attended the Vail Management Seminars organized by the Office of Continuing Education of the University of Chicago. 162 jobs are easier to enjoy. That leisure can be a problem for many people has been recognized for a long time by psychologists and psychiatrists. For example, the Group for the Advancement of Psychiatry ended one of its reports in 1958 with the bald statement, "For many Americans, leisure is dangerous." The same conclusion was reached by Gusson, 1967, who reviewed some of the psychological ills that people who cannot adapt to leisure manifest. The role of television as a way of masking the perils of free time has also been often remarked upon. For instance, Conrad, 1982, p. 108, writes, "The original technological revolution was about saving time, shortcutting labor. The consumerism, which is the latest installment of that revolution, is about wasting the time we've saved, and the institution it deputes to serve that purpose is television." The leisure industry. It is difficult to estimate the economic value of leisure because the worth of federal land used for recreation and the cost of the space devoted to leisure at home and in public buildings are truly incalculable. Direct spending on leisure in the United States has been estimated at $160 billion for 1980, double the amount for 1970 when adjusted for inflation. The average household spends about 5% of its income directly on leisure. Kelly, 1982, p. 9. Chapter 8, page Importance of Human Interaction. All the ESM studies show 165 that the quality of experience improves when there are other people around, and deteriorates whenever the person is alone, even if by his or her own choice. Larson and Csikszentmihalyi, 1978-1980. Larson, Csikszentmihalyi, S. L. Grafe, 1980. A vivid description of how and why people depend on public opinion for their own beliefs is given by Elizabeth Noel Newman, 1984. From a philosophical perspective, Martin Heidegger, 1962, has analyzed our continuous dependence on the they, or the intrapsychic representation of other people we carry in our minds. Related concepts are Charles Cooley's 1902 Generalized Other and Freud's superego, to be among men. This section is indebted to Hannah Arendt's brilliant treatment of the public and private realms in The Human Condition, 1958. 166. The Company of Others. Here again we refer to the findings of the ESM studies mentioned in the last note. That interactions with other people improve the mood for the entire day has been reported by Lewinsohn and Graff, 1973, Lewinsohn and Libet, 1972, McPhillamy and Lewinsohn, 1974, and Lewinsohn et al., 1982. Lewinsohn and his group have developed the clinical applications of a psychotherapy based on maximizing pleasant activities and interactions. If one were to develop a therapy based on flow, and steps in that direction have already been taken at the medical school of the University of Milan, Italy, this would also be the route to follow. That is, one would endeavor to increase the frequency and intensity of optimal experiences, rather than, or in addition to, decreasing the incidence of negative ones. Baboons. Stuart Altman, 1970, and Gene Altman, 1970-1980, know more about social relations among these primates than possibly anyone else. Their work indicates that the role of sociability for ensuring survival in such primates gives a good clue as to how and why human social instincts evolved. 166. People are flexible. It was Patrick Mayer's doctoral dissertation, 167, 1978, which utilized the experience sampling method for gathering data, that first alerted us to the fact that teenagers listed interactions with their friends as both the most enjoyable and also the most anxiety-producing and boring experiences in their day. This usually did not happen with other categories of activities, which were, in general, either always boring or always enjoyable. Since then, the finding has been replicated with adults also. 167. The realization of how important communication skills are for effective management was suggested by the data collected in the VALE program, see Note to 60. For middle managers especially, better communication is the number one strength they wish to develop. Books on etiquette. For a particularly mind-boggling example of such, see Letitia Baldridge's Complete Guide to a Great Social Life, whose advice includes such perfectly true but rather fulsome pearls of wisdom as, "Flattery is an immensely useful device, and any host is proud to have well-dressed guests at his or her party. They convey a sweet smell of success." Compare this last quote with Samuel Johnson's remark recorded in Boswell's Life, March 27, 1776. "Fine clothes are good only as they supply the want of other means of procuring respect." See review in Newsweek, October 5, 1987, p. 90. 68. Human relations are malleable. This has been one of the basic tenets of symbolic interactionism in sociology and anthropology. See Goffman, 1969-1974, Suttles, 1972. It also underlies the systems approach to family therapy, e.g., Jackson, 1957, Bateson, 1978, Bowen, 1978, and Hoffman, 1981. Intolerable solitude. See notes to P165. Sunday mornings. That people tended to have an unusual number of nervous breakdowns on Sunday mornings was already noted by psychoanalysts in turn-of-the-century Vienna. See Ferenczi, 1950. They, however, attributed the fact to more complicated causes than the ones we are postulating here. 169. The literature on television viewing is so enormous that even a short summary would probably be too long. A reasonably complete review is given in Csikszentmihalyi and Csikszentmihalyi in Press. Given the scale of the phenomenon and its social and economic implications, it is very difficult to maintain scientific objectivity when dealing with television. Some researchers stoutly defend it, claiming that viewers are perfectly able to use television for their own purposes and turn viewing to their advantage, while others interpret the data to show that it makes the viewers passive and discontented. Needless to say, this writer belongs to the second faction. 170. The conclusion that drugs are not consciousness expanding is based on interviews with about 200 artists whom our team has been studying for the past 25 years. See Getzels and Csikszentmihalyi 1965-1976, Csikszentmihalyi, Getzels, and Kahn 1984. Although artists have a tendency to glorify drug-induced experiences, I have yet to hear of a creative work, or at least one that the artists themselves thought was a good one, produced entirely under the influence of drugs. Coleridge and Kubla Khan. One of the most often quoted examples of how drugs help creativity is Coleridge's claim that he wrote Kubla Khan in a flash of inspiration caused by the ingestion of laudanum, or opium. But Schneider, 1953, has cast serious doubts on this story, presenting documentary evidence that Coleridge wrote several drafts of the poem and made up the opium story to appeal to the romantic tastes of early 19th century readers. Presumably, if he had lived now, he would have done the same. Our current research with talented teenagers shows that many fail to develop their skills not because they have cognitive deficits, but because they cannot stand being alone and are left behind by their peers who can tolerate the difficult learning and practicing required to perfect a talent. For a first report on this topic, see Nakamura 1988 and Robinson 1986. In the latter study, equally talented high school mathematics students were divided into those who, by objective and subjective criteria, were still involved in math by senior year, and those who were not. It was found that the involved students spent 15% of their waking time outside of school studying, 6% in structured leisure activities, e.g., playing a musical instrument, doing sports, and 14% in unstructured activities, like hanging out with buddies and socializing. For those no longer involved, the respective percentages were 5%, 2%, and 26%. Since each percentage point corresponds to about 1 hour spent in the activity each week, the figures mean that students still involved in math spend 1 hour a week more studying than in unstructured socializing, whereas those no longer involved spend 21 more hours a week socializing than studying. When a teenager becomes exclusively dependent on the company of peers, there is little chance to develop a complex skill. 173. The description of Dorothy's lifestyle is based on personal experience. For Susan Butcher, see The Blue Yorker, Oct. 5th, 1987, 34-35. 176. Kinship groups. One of the most eloquent essays on the civilizing effects of the family on humankind is Levi Strauss's Les Structures Élémentaires de la Parente, 1947-1969. The sociobiological claim was first articulated by Hamilton, 1964, Trivers, 1972, Alexander, 1974, and E. O. Wilson, 1975. For later contributions to this topic, see Solins, 1976, Alexander, 1979, Lumsden and Wilson, 1983, and Boyd and Richardson, 1985. The attachment literature is now very large. The classics in the area include work by John Bowlby, 1969, and Mary D. Ainsworth et al., 1978. Primogeniture. For the effects of inheritance laws in Europe, see Habakkuk, 1955. In France, see Pitts, 1964. In Austria and Germany, see Mitterauer and Cedar, 1983. 179. Monogamy. According to some sociobiologists, however, monogamy does have an absolute advantage over other mating combinations. If we assume that siblings help each other more in proportion to the genes they share, then children of monogamous marriages will help each other more because they share more genes than children whose parents are not the same. Thus, under selective pressures, children of monogamous couples will get more help and thus might survive more easily and reproduce proportionately more than children of polygamous couples growing up in a similar environment. Moving from the biological to the cultural level of explanation, it seems clear that, other things being equal, stable monogamous couples are able to provide better psychological as well as financial resources for their children. Just from a strictly economic point of view, serial monogamy, or the frequency of divorce, seems to be an inefficient way of redistributing income and property. For the plight of one-parent families, economic and otherwise, see, for instance, Hetherington, 1979, McClanahan, 1988, and Tessman, 1978. Cystothoris palustris. The marital practices of the marsh wren are described in the Encyclopaedia Britannica, 1985, Vol. 14, p. 701. Cicero's quote about freedom was printed in my 7th grade school assignment diary, but despite several attempts, I have been unable to find its source. I sincerely hope it is not apocryphal. 180. Family complexity. Following the lead of Pagels' 1988 definition of complexity, we could also say that a family whose interactions are more difficult to describe and whose future interactions are more difficult to predict on the basis of present knowledge is more complex than a family that is easier to describe and to predict. Such a measure would presumably give very similar results to a measure of complexity based on differentiation and integration. 183 Suburban teenagers. The anthropologist Jules Henry, 1965, gave a profoundly insightful description of what growing up in suburban communities entailed a generation ago. More recently, Schwartz, 1987, compared 6 Midwestern communities in terms of what opportunities they gave adolescents for experiencing freedom and self-respect, and found striking differences from one community to the next, which suggests that sweeping generalizations about what is involved in being a teenager in our society might not be very accurate if parents talked more. In one study of adolescents at a very good suburban high school, we found that although teenagers spent 12.7% of their waking time with parents, time alone with fathers amounted to an average of only 5 minutes a day, half of which was spent watching television together. Csikszentmihalyi and Larson, 1984, p. 73. It is difficult to imagine how any deep communication of values can occur in such short periods. It might be true that it is quality time that counts, but after a certain point, quantity has a bearing on quality. No 184 teenage pregnancy. The United States now leads other developed countries in teenage pregnancies, abortions, and childbearing. For every 1,000 girls between the ages of 15 and 19, 96 get pregnant in the United States each year. Next is France, with 43 pregnancies per 1,000, Mall 1985. The number of out-of-wedlock births to teenagers has doubled between 1960 and 1980, Schiamberg 1988, p. 718. At present rates, it has been estimated that 40% of today's 14-year-old girls will become pregnant at least once before they turn 20, Wallace et al. 1985. Families that provide flow. The characteristics of families that facilitate the development of autotelic personalities in children are being studied by Rathanda, 1988. 186 positive moods with friends. When teenagers are with friends, they report very significantly higher levels of happiness, self-esteem, strength, and motivation, but lower levels of concentration and cognitive efficiency than they report in any other social context. Csikszentmihalyi and Larson, 1984. The same pattern is true for older people studied with the ESM. For example, married adults and retired couples report more intense positive moods when they are with friends than when they are with their spouses or children or anyone else. Drinking patterns. The different patterns of public drinking and the resultant patterns of social interaction that they make possible have been described in Csikszentmihalyi, 1968. 188. Instrumental versus expressive. The distinction between these two functions was introduced into the sociological literature by Talcott Parsons, 1942. For a contemporary application, C. Schwartz, 1987, who argues that one of the main problems with teenagers is that there are too few opportunities for expressive behavior within the boundaries of society, and thus they have to resort to deviance. 19D Politics. Hannah Arendt, 1958. Defines politics as the mode of interaction that allows individuals to get objective feedback about their strengths and weaknesses. In a political situation, where a person is given a chance to argue a point of view and to convince peers of its worth, the hidden capabilities of an individual are allowed to surface. But this kind of impartial feedback can only occur in a public realm, where each person is willing to listen and evaluate others on their merit. According to Arendt, the public realm is the best medium for personal growth, creativity, and self-revelation. 19.1. Irrationality of economic approaches. Max Weber, 1930-1958, in his famous essay on the Protestant ethic, argued that the apparent rationality of economic calculation was deceptive. Hard work, savings, investment, the entire science of production and consumption are justified because of the belief that they make life happier. But, Weber claimed, after this science was perfected, it developed its own goals, based on the logic of production and consumption, and not that of human happiness. At that point, economic behavior ceases to be rational, because it is no longer guided by the goal that originally justified it. Weber's argument applies to many other activities that, after developing clear goals and rules, become autonomous from their original purposes and begin to be pursued for intrinsic reasons, because they are fun to do. This was recognized by Weber himself, who complained that capitalism, which originated as a religious vocation, had in time become a mere sport for entrepreneurs and an iron cage for everyone else. See also Csikszentmihalyi and Rochberg-Halton, 1981, Chapter 9. Chapter 9 page. This entire section to P198 draws heavily on interview transcripts, 193 made available to me by Professor Massimini. One translated the Italian answers into English. The quote by Franz Alexander was cited in Siegelt 1986 P1. Norman Cousins' strategy for controlling his illness is described in his Anatomy of an Illness 1979. 198. When a Man Knows is from Johnson's Letters to Bossu L., September 19, 1777. Stress. Hans Selye, who began studying the physiology of stress in 1934, defined it as the generalized result, whether mental or physical, of any demand on the body, 1956-1978. An important breakthrough in the investigation of psychological effects of such demands was the development of a scale that attempts to measure their severity, Holmes and Rahi, 1967. On this scale, the highest stress is caused by death of spouse with a value of 100, marriage has a value of 50, and Christmas a value of 12. In other words, the impact of 4 Christmases is almost equal to the stress of getting married. It is to be noted that both negative and positive events can cause stress, since they both present demands one must adapt to. Supports. Of the various resources that mitigate the effects of stressful events, social supports or social networks have been studied the most extensively, Lieberman et al. 1979. Family and friends often provide material help, emotional support, and needed information, Schaefer, Coyne, and Lazarus 1981. But even interest in other people seems to alleviate stress. Those who have a concern for other people and concerns beyond the self have fewer stressful experiences, and stress has less effect on anxiety, depression, and hostility. They make more active attempts to cope with their problems. Crandall, 1984, p. 72. 99. Coping styles. The experience of stress is mediated by a person's coping style. The same event might have positive or negative psychological outcomes, depending on the person's inner resources. Hardiness is a term coined by Salvatore Matti and Suzanne Kobasa to describe the tendency of certain people to respond to threats by transforming them into manageable challenges. The 3 main components of hardiness are commitment to one's goals, a sense of being in control, and enjoyment of challenges. Kobasa, Matti, and Kahn, 1982. A similar term is Vaillant's 1977 concept of mature defense, Lazarus's concept of coping. Lazarus and Folkman, 1984, and the concept of personality strength, measured in German surveys by Elizabeth Noel Newman, 1983-1985. All of these coping styles, hardiness, mature defenses, and transformational coping, share many characteristics with the autotelic personality trait described in this volume. 200. Courage. That people consider courage the foremost reason for admiring others emerged from the data of my 3-generation family study when Bert Lyons analyzed it for his PhD dissertation, 1988. 21. Dissipative structures. For the meaning of this term in the natural sciences, see Prigogine, 1980. 2. Transformational skills in adolescence. One longitudinal study conducted with the ESM, Freeman, Larson, S.L. Csikszentmihalyi, 1986, suggests that older teenagers have just as many negative experiences with family, with friends, and alone as younger teenagers do, but that they interpret them more leniently. That is, the conflicts that at 13 years of age seemed tragic at 17 are seen to be perfectly manageable. 2. Unself-conscious self-assurance. For the development of this concept, see Logan, 1985-1988. 205. Each individual crystal. This quote from Chouinard was reported in Robinson, 1969, p. 6. My cockpit is small is from Lindbergh, 1953, pp. 227-28. 208. Discovering new goals. That a complex self emerges out of various experiences in the world, just as a creative painting emerges out of the interaction between the artist and his materials, has been argued in Csikszentmihalyi, 1985a. And Csikszentmihalyi and Beatty, 1979. Artist's discovery. The process of problem-finding or discovery in art is described in a variety of papers starting with Csikszentmihalyi, 1965, and ending with Csikszentmihalyi and Getzels, 1989. See also Getzels and Csikszentmihalyi, 1976. Very briefly, our findings show that art students who in 1964 painted in the manner described here, i.e., who approached the canvas without a clearly worked-out image of the finished painting, were 18 years later significantly more successful by the standards of the artistic community than their peers who worked out the finished product in their minds beforehand. Other characteristics, such as technical competence, did not differentiate the two groups. 209. Setting realistic goals. It has been reported that adults who commit themselves to very long-term goals, with few short-term rewards, are less satisfied with their lives than people who have easier short-term goals. B. 1987, p. 373. On the other hand, the flow model suggests that having too easy goals would be equally dissatisfying. Neither extreme allows a person to enjoy life fully. Chapter 10 page. Hannah Arendt describes the difference between meaning systems 218, built on eternity and immortality, in her The Human Condition, 1958. 219. Sorokin worked out his classification of cultures in the 4 volumes of his Social and Cultural Dynamics, which appeared in 1937. An abridged single volume with the same title was published in 1962. Sorokin's work has been forgotten almost completely by sociologists, perhaps because of his old-fashioned idealism, perhaps because in the crucial decades of the 1950s and 1960s, it was overshadowed by that of his much more theoretically astute colleague at Harvard, Talcott Parsons. It is likely that with time, this enormously wide-ranging and methodologically innovative scholar will receive the recognition he deserves. 221. Sequences in the development of the self. Very similar theories of stages of development that alternate between attention focused on the self and attention focused primarily on the social environment were developed by Erikson, 1950, who believed that adults had to develop a sense of identity, then intimacy, then generativity, and finally reach a stage of integrity, by Maslow, 1954, whose hierarchy of needs led from physiological safety needs to self-actualization through love and belongingness, by Kohlberg, 1984, who claimed that moral development started from a sense of right and wrong based on self-interest and ended with ethics based on universal principles, and by Lovinger, 1976, who saw ego development proceed from impulsive self-protective action to a sense of integration with the environment. Helen B., 1987, especially chapters 10 and 13, gives a good summary of these and other spiraling models of development. 225. Vita activa and vita contemplativa. These Aristotelian terms are extensively used by Thomas Aquinas in his analysis of the good life and by Hannah Arendt, 1958. 226. A description of how the Jesuit rules helped create order in the consciousness of those who followed them is given in Isabella Csikszentmihalyi, 1986-1988, and Marco Toscano, 1986. Emergence of consciousness. A stab in the direction of speculating about how consciousness emerged in human beings was made by Janes, 1977, who ascribes it to the connection between the left and right cerebral hemispheres, which he speculates occurred only about 3,000 years ago. See also Alexander, 1987, and Calvin, 1986. Of course, this fascinating question is likely to remain forever beyond the reach of certainty. 227. The inner life of animals. To what extent animals other than humans, 228, have feelings that approach ours has been extensively debated. See von Uexküll, 1921. Recent studies of primates who communicate with people seem to suggest that some of them do have emotions even in the absence of concrete stimuli, e.g., that they can feel sad at the memory of a departed companion, but the evidence on this issue does not yet appear conclusive. 228. The consciousness of preliterate people. Among many others, the anthropologist Robert Redfield, 1955, argued that tribal societies were too simple and homogeneous for their members to be able to take a self-reflective stance toward their beliefs and actions. Before the first urban revolution made cities possible about 5,000 years ago, people tended to accept the reality their culture presented to them without much question and had no alternatives to conformity. Others, such as the anthropologist Paul Radin, 1927, have claimed to find great philosophical sophistication and freedom of conscience among primitive people. It is doubtful that this ancient debate will be resolved soon. 229. Leo Tolstoy's novella has been often reprinted. See Tolstoy, 1886, 1985. That the complexification of social roles has resulted in the complexification of consciousness has been argued by de Roberti, 1878, and by Dragachesco, 1906, who developed elaborate theoretical models of social evolution based on the assumption that intelligence is a function of the frequency and intensity of human interactions, and by many others ever since, including the Russian psychologists Vygotsky, 1978, and Luria, 1976. Sartre's concept of the project is described in Being and Nothingness, 1956. The concept of propriate strivings was introduced by Allport, 1955. For the concept of life theme, defined as a set of problems which a person wishes to solve above everything else and the means the person finds to achieve solution, see Csikszentmihalyi and Beatty, 1979. 2-1 Hannah Arendt, 1963, wrote an authoritative analysis of the life of Adolf Eichmann. The autobiography of Malcolm X, 1977, is a classic description of the development of a life theme. 233 Blueprint of Negentropic Life Themes. The counterintuitive notion that transference of attention from personal problems to the problems of others helps personal growth underlies the work of the developmental psychologists mentioned in the note to page 221. See also Crandall, 1984, and note to P198. The best English-language biography of Antonio Gramsci is by Giuseppe Fiore, 1973. 234, 235, 236, 238, 239. Edison, Roosevelt, and Einstein. Gortzel and Gortzel, 1962, detail the early lives of 300 eminent men and women and show how little predictability there is between the conditions in which children grow up and their later achievements. Cultural evolution is another concept prematurely discarded by social scientists in the last few decades. Among the attempts to show that the concept is still viable, see, for instance, Burho, 1982, Csikszentmihalyi and Massimini, 1985, Lumsden and L. Wilson, 1981, 1983, Massimini, 1982, and White, 1975. Books as socializing agents. For studies on the effect of books and stories told in childhood on the subsequent life themes of individuals, see Csikszentmihalyi and Beatty, 1979, and Beatty and Csikszentmihalyi, 1981. Religion and entropy. See, for instance, Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel's early essay, written in 1798 but not published until 110 years later. Der Geist der Christentums und sein Schicksal, the spirit of Christianity and its fate, in which he reflects on the materialization that Christ's teachings underwent after they were embedded into a church. Evolution. A great many scholars and scientists from a diverse variety of backgrounds have expressed the belief that a scientific understanding of evolution, taking into account the goals of human beings and the laws of the universe, will provide the basis for a new system of meanings. See, for instance, Burho, 1976, Campbell, 1965, 1975, 1976, Csikszentmihalyi and Massimini, 1985, Csikszentmihalyi and Rothunde, 1989, Teilhard de Chardin, 1965, Huxley, 1942, Mead, 1964, Medawar, 1960, and Waddington, 1970. It is on this faith that a new civilization may be built. But evolution does not guarantee progress, Nitecki, 1988. Humankind may be left out of the evolutionary process altogether. Whether it will or not depends to a large extent on the choices we are about to make, and these choices are likely to be more intelligent if we understand how evolution works. References: Ach N. 1905, Über die Willenstätigkeit und des Denkens, Göttingen, Vandenhoek and Ruprecht. Adler A. 1956, The Individual Psychology of Alfred Adler. New York, Basic Books. Adler, M.J., 1956, Why Only Adults Can Be Educated, in Great Issues in Education, Chicago, Great Books Foundation. Ainsworth, M.D.S., Bell, S.M., Staton, D.J., 1971, Individual Differences in Strange Situation Behavior of One-Year-Olds. In H.R. Schaffer, ed., The Origins of Human Social Relations, London, Academic Press. Ainsworth, M., Blehar, M., Waters, E., and Wall, S., 1978, Patterns of Attachment, Hillsdale, N.J., Earlbaum. Alexander R.D., 1974, The Evolution of Social Behavior, Annual Review of Ecology and Systematics 5, 325-83, 1979. Evolution and Culture, in N.A. Chagnon and W. Irons Edes, Evolutionary Biology and Human Social Behavior, An Anthropological Perspective, pp. 59-78, North Scituate, Mass., Duxbury Press. 1987, The Biology of Moral Systems, New York, Aldine de Guiter. Allison M.T., Duncan M.C., 1988, Women, Work, and Flow. In M. Csikszentmihalyi and I.S. Csikszentmihalyi eds, Optimal Experience, Studies of Flow and Consciousness, pp. 118-37. New York, Cambridge University Press. Allport, G.W. 1955, Becoming Basic Considerations for a Psychology of Personality, New Haven, Yale University Press. Altman, J. 1980, Baboon Mothers and Infants, Cambridge Harvard University Press. Altman, S.A. and Altman, J. 1970, Baboon Ecology, African Field Research, Chicago, University of Chicago Press. Alvarez, A. 1973, The Savage God, New York Bantam. Amabile, T.M. 1983, The Social Psychology of Creativity, New York, Springer Verlag. Andreasen, N.C., 1987, Creativity and Mental Illness, Prevalence Rates in Writers and Their First-Degree Relatives. American Journal of Psychiatry 144, 10, Twun 1288-92. Andrews, F.M., and Withy, S.B. 1976, Social Indicators of Well-Being, New York, Plenum. Angial, A. 1941, Foundations for a Science of Personality, Cambridge, Harvard University Press. 1965, Neurosis and Treatment, A Holistic Theory, New York, Wiley. Aquinas T. 1985, Summa Theologica, Aquinas Summa, An Introduction and Interpretation by E.J. Gratch. New York, Alba House. Archimedes Foundation, 1988, Directory of Human Happiness and Well-Being, Toronto. Arendt H. 1958, The Human Condition, Chicago University of Chicago Press. 1963, Eichmann in Jerusalem, New York, Viking Press. Argyll M. 1987, The Psychology of Happiness, London, Methuen. Aries P. and Dubey G. Jen E. Dietz, 1987, A History of Private Life, Cambridge, Mass., Belknap Press. Aristotle, 1980, Nicomachean Ethics, Book 1, Book 3, Chapter 11, Book 7, Chapter 11, Book 9, Chapters 9-10, in Aristodes' Nicomachean Ethics, Commentary and Analysis by F. H. Eterovich. Washington, D.C., University Press of America. Arnheim, R. 1954, Art and Visual Perception, A Psychology of the Creative Eye, Berkeley, University of California Press. 1971, Entropy and Art, Berkeley, University of California Press. 1982, The Power of the Center, Berkeley, University of California Press. Arnold E. V., 1911-1971, Roman Stoicism, New York, Books for Libraries Press. Atkinson R. C. and Schifrin R. M., 1968, Human Memory, A Proposed System and Its Control Processes, in K. Spence and J. Spence eds, The Psychology of Learning and Motivation, Vol. 2, New York, Academic Press. Baldridge L. 1987, Letitia Baldridge's Complete Guide to a Great Social Life, New York, Ross and Assas. Bandura A. 1982, Self-Efficacy Mechanisms in Human Agency, American Psychologist 37 122-47. Bateson G. 1978, The Birth of a Double Bind, in M. Berger, ed., Beyond the Double Bind, p. 53, New York, Brunner Mazel. Baumgarten A. 1735-1936, Reflections on in B. Croce ed. Aesthetica, Bari, Laterza. Baumrin D. 1977. Socialization Determinants of Personal Agency. Paper presented at Biennial Meeting of the Society for Research in Child Development, New Orleans. Beatty O. and Csikszentmihalyi M. 1981, On the Socialization Influence of Books, Child Psychology and Human Development 11, 318. Beck A.T. 1976, Cognitive Therapy and Emotional Disorders, New York, International Universities Press. B.H.L. 1987, The Journey of Adulthood, New York, Macmillan. Behanen, K.T. 1937, Yoga, A Scientific Evaluation, New York, Macmillan. Bell D. 1976, The Cultural Contradictions of Capitalism, New York, Basic Books. Bella R.N. 1975, The Broken Covenant, American Civil Religion in a Time of Trial, New York, Seabury Press. Benedict R. 1934, Patterns of Culture, Boston, Houghton Mifflin. Berdiev N. 1952, The Beginning and the End, London, Geoffrey Blaise. Berger, P.L., and Luckman T. 1967, The Social Construction of Reality, Garden City, NY, Anchor Books. Bergler E. 1970, The Psychology of Gambling, New York, International Universities Press. Berlin D.E. 1960, Conflict, Arousal, and Curiosity, New York, McGraw-Hill. Berman, Marshall Howard, 1982, All That Is Solid Melts into Air, New York, Simon & Schuster. Berman Morris, 1988, The Two Faces of Creativity, in J. Brockman, ed., The Reality Club, pp. 9-38, New York, Lynx Books. Bettelheim B. 1943, Individual and Mass Behavior in Extreme Situations, Journal of Abnormal and Social Psychology 38 452. Binet A. 1890, La concurrence des états psychologiques, Revue philosophique de la France et de Diatrandre 24 138-55. Blom F. 1932, The Maya Ball Game, in Emery's ed. Middle American Research Series 1, New Orleans, Tulane University Press. Bloom A. 1987, The Closing of the American Mind, New York, Simon & Schuster. Blumberg, S. H., and Izard C. E. 1985, Affective and Cognitive Characteristics of Depression in 10 and 11-year-old Children, Journal of Personality and Social Psychology 49-194-202. Boring, E. G. 1953, A History of Introspection, Psychological Bulletin 50, 169-89. Boswell, J. 1964, Life of Samuel Johnson, New York, McGraw. Bergingen, E. 1979, Psychological Anthropology, New York, Holt, Reinhardt and Winston. Bowen, E. S., Sued of Laura Bohannon, 1954, Return to Laughter, New York, Harper Cecil Braz. Bowen, M., 1978, Family Therapy and Clinical Practice, New York, Aronson. Bowlby, J., 1969, Attachment and Loss, Vol. 1, Attachment, New York, Basic Books. Boyd, R., and Richardson, P.J., 1985, Culture and the Evolutionary Process, Chicago, University of Chicago Press. Bradburn, N., 1969, The Structure of Psychological Well-Being, Chicago, Aldine. Brandwine, R.A., 1977, After Divorce, A Focus on Single-Parent Families, Urban and Social Change Review, 1021-25. Braudel, F., 1981, The Structures of Everyday Life, Voller 2, Civilization and Capitalism, 15th-18th Century, New York, Harper & Row. Bronfenbrenner, U., 1970, Two Worlds of Childhood, New York, Russell Sage. Brown, N.O., 1959, Life Against Death, Middletown Con, Wesleyan University Press. Buhler, C. 1930, Die Geistigen Entwicklung des Kindes, Gina, G. Fisher. Burho, R. W., 1976, The Source of Civilization in the Natural Selection of Co-Adapted Information in Genes and Cultures, Zygon 11, 363 303, 1982, Pleasure and Reason as Adaptations to Nature's Requirements, Zygon 7-2, 113-31. Burney, C. 1952, Solitary Confinement, London, Macmillan. KUAR, 1958, Les Jeux at Liz Holmes, Paris, Gallimard. Calvin, W.H. 1986, The River That Flows Uphill, A Journey from the Big Bang to the Big Brain, New York, Macmillan. Campbell, A.P. 1972, Aspiration, Satisfaction, and Fulfillment, in A.P. Campbell and P.E. Converse Eads, The Human Meaning of Social Change, pp. 441-66, New York, Russell Sage. Campbell, A.P., Converse, P.E., and Rogers, W.L. 1976, The Quality of American Life, New York, Russell Sage. Campbell, D.T. 1965, Variation and Selective Retention in Sociocultural Evolution, in H.R. Barringer, G.I., Blankston, and R.W. Monk Eads, Social Change in Developing Areas, pp. 19-42. Cambridge, Schenkman, 1975, On the Conflicts Between Biological and Social Evolution and Between Psychology and Moral Tradition, American Psychologist 30-1103-25. 1976, Evolutionary Epistemology, in D.A. Schlipp ed., The Library of Living Philosophers, pp. 413-63, LaSalle 111, Open Court. Carly, M. 1986, Selezione psicologica e qualità dell'esperienza, in F. Massimini and P. Angillari eds, L'esperienza quotidiana, pp. 285-304, Milan, Franco Angeli. Carpenter, E. 1970, They Became What They Beheld, New York, Ballantine. 1973, Eskimo Realities, New York, Holt. Carrington, P. 1977, Freedom in Meditation, New York, Doubleday Anchor. Carson, J. 1965, Colonial Virginians at Play, Williamsburg, Va. Colonial Williamsburg, Inc. Carver, J. 1796, Travels Through the Interior Parts of North America, Philadelphia. Castaneda, C. 1971, A Separate Reality, New York, Simon & Schuster. 1974, Tales of Power, New York, Simon & Schuster. Chagnon, N. 1979, Mate Competition, Favoring Close Kin, and Village Fissioning Among the Yanomamo Indians, in N.A. Chagnon and W. Irons eds, Evolutionary Biology and Human Social Behavior, pp. 86-132. North Scituate, Mass. Duxbury Press. Cheng, N. 1987, Life and Death in Shanghai, New York, Grove Press. Chicago Tribune, 24 September 1987. Chicago Tribune, 18th of October 1987. Clark, A. 1919, The Working Life of Women in the 17th Century, London. Clausen, J. A. ed. 1968. Socialization and Society, Boston, Little Brown. Kohler, B. J. 1982. Personal Narrative and the Life Course, in P. B. Bates and O. G. Brim, eds. Lifespan Development and Behavior, Vol. 4. New York, Academic Press. Collingwood, R.G. 1938, The Principles of Art, London, Oxford University Press. Conrad P., 1982, Television, the Medium and Its Manners, Boston, Routledge and Kagan. Cooley, C.H., 1902, Human Nature and the Social Order, New York, Charles Scribner's Sons. Cooper, D., 1970, The Death of the Family, New York, Pantheon. Cousins, N., 1979, Anatomy of an Illness as Perceived by the Patient, New York, Norton. Crandall, J. E., 1984, Social Interest as a Moderator of Life Stress, Journal of Personality and Social Psychology, 47 164-74. Crandall, M., 1983, On Walking Without Touching the Ground, Play in the Inner Chapters of the Chuang-Tzu, in V. H. Muir, ed., Experimental Essays on Chuang-Tzu, pp. 101-23, Honolulu, University of Hawaii Press. Kreolak, W. I. B., 1951, Vagabonding Under Sail, New York, David McKay. Croce, B., 1902-1909, Aesthetics, New York, Macmillan, 1962, History as the Story of Liberty, London, Allen and Unwin. Crook, J. H., 1980, The Evolution of Human Consciousness, New York, Oxford University Press. Csikszentmihalyi, I. 1986, Tu flusso di coscienza in un contesto storico, te caso dei Gesuiti. In F. Massimini and P. Ingilleri, eds. L'Esperienza Quotidiana, pp. 181-96, Milan, Franco Angeli, 1988. Flow in a Historical Context, The Case of the Jesuits. In M. Csikszentmihalyi and I. S. Csikszentmihalyi, eds. Optimal Experience, Psychological Studies of Flow in Consciousness, pp. 32-48, New York, Cambridge University Press. Csikszentmihalyi, M. 1965, Artistic Problems and Their Solution, An Exploration of Creativity in the Arts. Unpublished doctoral dissertation, University of Chicago, May, 1968. A Cross-Cultural Comparison of Some Structural Characteristics of Group Drinking. Human Development 11, 201-16. 1969. The Americanization of Rock Climbing. University of Chicago Magazine 61 6 22-7, 1970. Sociological Implications in the Thought of Teilhard de Chardin. Zygon 5-2, 130-47, 1973. Sociocultural Speciation and Human Aggression. Zygon 8 296,